In this video, we'll be looking at 700 battles worth of testing and over 100 hours worth of work to show you which shield infantry units are the best. We've rounded up all the shielded infantry in the game and pitted them against each other, as well as against Fiend champions, Consguard, and other archers in melee-only mode, dismounted noble cavalry, and finally against an assortment of shielded troops from Tier 1 through Tier 4. Each match will consist of 10 battles in order to gain some degree of statistical relevance. We'll point out any interesting qualitative notes during the sample battle, go over the data after each, and do a final wrap-up with a tier list for all the units tested at the end. And we've included chapters for you to easily reference these in the future. Let's get started. Imperial Legionary versus Vlandian Sergeant. Their relevant stats are identical with 130 in polearm athletics and one-handed. There was no noticeable advantage while watching the battles, but the Legionary would always pull ahead and by a wide margin, most likely due to weapons and armor loadouts. Moving on to the data, Legionary dominated all 10 battles without a single loss. They managed to kill nearly 2-1 against the Sergeants, making them a clear winner. Imperial Legionary versus Battanian Oathsworn. Again, we see identical relevant stats between the two. As soon as the lines meet, it's obvious how outmatched the Oathsworn are. Their lines crumble and flee without much of a fight. The biggest difference between these two units is the armor. Legionary has 42 while Oathsworn have only 28. Looking at the data, it's even worse than I thought, as high as 7-1 KDR with an average of 4.5. Clearly, the Oathsworn are outmatched here. Imperial Legionary versus Battania Wildling. We see a slight advantage for the Wildling in athletics, but a deficit in one-handed. Since both sides are on hold fire, their projectiles and throwing skill aren't a factor here. We see another similar result with the Wildling getting completely stomped. Their body armor is quite good, but head, arm, and leg armor are lacking, most likely causing their poor performance. Looking at the data, the KDR swung as high as 9 and averaged out to 6.8. Wildlings should avoid Legionary when in equal numbers. Imperial Legionary versus Aserai Veteran Infantry. For the first time, we see a unit with better stats than the Legionary, boasting 160 one-handed skill. Hopefully this skill gap makes a difference. While the Aserai troops do fare better than the previous opponents, it's still a convincing win for the Legionary. Both units have comparable armor, so the difference most likely comes down to the weapons. Moving over to the data, the Veteran Infantry gave the Legionary a tough fight, even winning one of the engagements. The KDR was much closer to even this time at 1.8. Imperial Legionary versus Khuzait Darkhan. The Darkhan have identical relevant stats to the Legionary. Looking at the sample battle, they seem to hold their own, but eventually get grinded down. Looking at the data for this set confirms this. Legionary win all 10 matches, but some were fairly close. Overall, Legionary earned a 3.6 KDR against the Khuzait infantry. Imperial Legionary versus Sturgian Heavy Spearmen. Now for the infantry dominant faction, Sturgia. The Heavy Spearman has a slightly better polearm and one-handed stats, but probably not enough to make a difference. Unfortunately for Sturgia, their Spearmen are quickly swallowed whole by the Legionary, forcing an early rout. However, I was a bit surprised to see the data for this set. They held up decently against the Legionary compared to previous tests, keeping the Legionary to 2.5 KDR. It's not great, but much better than Battania. Imperial Legionary versus Sturgia Heavy Axemen. Let's hope the other Sturgian heavy infantry can stand up to the Legionary, having comparable one-handed and athletic skill. Sadly, when we look at the kill feed for the sample battle, it's completely one-sided, and the Axemen are quickly routed. Their shoulder armor is severely lacking compared to the Legionary as well as the reach of their primary weapon. No, there's nothing wrong with your screen. I can assure you these numbers are accurate, no matter how gruesome they seem. The Legionary managed a massive 52.5 KDR against the Axemen. Imperial Legionary versus Imperial Sergeant Crossbowmen. Now it's time to test one of the Tier 5 ranged units against the Legionary. The Crossbowman has comparable stats to the Legionary, but also wields a mace as a primary weapon. Right away, we can see a huge difference. The Crossbowmen are holding their own. The battle goes down to the last handful of men, but could have easily gone either way. At last, we have a unit that can stand up to the Legionary. The Sergeant Crossbowmen not only managed to keep up with the KDR, but also won 50% of the battles. Clearly, the mace as a sidearm made all the difference. Imperial Legionary versus Elite Cataphract. I get tons of comments about dismounted cavalry being better than foot troops, so here we'll settle it. The Cataphract have a huge advantage in one-handed skill, but a deficit in athletics. It's pretty clear that the Legionary aren't getting stomped. It's a fairly close fight, but the Legionary come out on top in the end. Looking at the data, the Legionary are dominant with a nearly 2.0 KDR and 90% win rate. Imperial Legionary versus Consguard. Up next, dismount and hold fire Consguard. They use the deadly glaive polearm with 220 polearm skill to the Legionary's 130. I'm sure some of you already know what happens next. The Legionary get completely destroyed. Not only do the Khan's guards have more combat skill, but the glaive is a nasty weapon that one-taps just about everything. The data confirms this. Legionary didn't win a single battle and end with only a 0.27 KDR. Imperial Legionary versus Fian Champion. Now for another tough matchup. They use a two-handed sword and have 220 combat skill with it. Again, they're placed on hold fire and engage in melee only. Once again, we see a huge advantage for the Fians right from the start, although it doesn't seem as big as the Khan's guard. The glaive does more damage and has more reach than the Fian's two-handed sword. Looking at the stats, we see another 100% loss rate for the Legionary, but the KDR was slightly better than the previous test at 0.4. Imperial Legionary versus mixed lower tier infantry. For the final Legionary battle, we use tier 1 through tier 4 infantry groups and make sure the wages for both sides are equal. This equates to 250 Legionary versus 667 mixed unit troops. The battle starts off strong for the Legionary, taking out massive amounts of lower tier troops. But as time drags on, the weight of their numbers tilts the scales in favor of the lower tier mob. The Legionary are defeated by a decent margin. Looking at the data, the Legionary performed quite well, taking out more than 2 enemies for every 1 loss, but they needed to maintain at least 2.67 KDR to keep up with their numbers. They did manage to win 3 out of the 10 battles, so it's not a complete loss. Vlandian Sergeant versus Battanian Oathsworn. Now let's look at Vlandia versus Battania, starting with the Oathsworn. Once again, relevant stats are identical. The fighting is back and forth the whole time, coming down to the last handful of troops in the sample battle. But if we look at the data, the trend continues with most battles being close, but still going Vlandia's way. Although the Oathsworn did win 1 battle out of 10. The final KDR sits at 1.8. Vlandian Sergeant versus Battania Wildling. Let's see if the Wildling will fare any better, having slightly better athletics, but worse combat skills. Sadly, that's not the case. The Wildling are outclassed from start to finish, leading to a landslide victory in favor of Vlandia. Looking at the data, we see a 100% win rate for Vlandia and a solid 3.4 KDR. Vlandia Sergeant versus Aserai Veteran Infantry. The Veteran Infantry have a slight advantage over the Sergeant in one-handed skill, but comparable elsewhere. It's an incredibly close battle with neither side gaining the upper hand. The Vlandians flee first, but it was a razor-thin margin. The data confirms this, with Vlandia winning 2 out of the 10 and still maintaining a respectable 7.6 KDR against the Veteran Infantry. Vlandia Sergeant versus Khuzait Darkhan. The Darkhan have comparable relevant stats. To my surprise, the Sergeants pull out to an early lead and end up stomping the Darkhan. The data shows a different story though, which is why we run at least 10 tests for each battle. The Darkhan actually managed to win 3 out of the 10 battles, with the Sergeants earning a 1.2 KDR. Unlike the sample battle, they are very closely matched. Vlandia Sergeant versus Sturgia Heavy Spearmen. Now to see if the Sturgian infantry can redeem themselves, starting with the Heavy Spearmen with better combat stats but less athletics. While the battle is fairly close, the Vlandians do pull ahead by the end with a decent margin. Another sad day for Sturgia. Looking over the data, we do see Sturgia winning 3 out of the 10, but the Sergeants maintain a solid 1.45 KDR over them. Vlandia Sergeant versus Sturgian Heavy Axemen. With comparable relevant stats, I'm hoping the Axemen actually do something this time. And to my surprise, they actually perform okay considering the bloodbath they had with the Legionary. It's still a heavy loss, but not a wipeout. The data looks quite similar to the Spearmen with 3 overall wins, but the Vlandia KDR actually went down some to 1.2. I've always thought of the Axemen to be better against infantry than Spearmen, so we'll keep an eye out on these matchups. Vlandia Sergeant versus Imperial Sergeant Crossbowmen. Let's see how they stack up against the same Imperial Crossbowmen with the mace. It's a really close battle up to the end where it seems the Crossbowmen morale took a huge hit. Considering how well they performed against the Legionary, I was expecting the Crossbowmen to sweep the Vlandians, but Vlandia won 7 of the 10 battles and came out with a 1.3 KDR. Vlandia Sergeant versus Imperial Elite Cataphract. Now let's see how the Elite Cataphract can hold up while dismounted. Unfortunately for Vlandia, their infantry are dominated here and by a wide margin. It's certainly not the worst performance we've seen so far, but with only 2 victories out of 10 and a 0.7 KDR, it wasn't ideal. Vlandia Sergeants versus Khuzait Khan's Guard. I think we all know the Khan's Guard and Fian champions won't be beat by any shielded infantry. We'll continue to test in order to see who fares the best. And as expected, the Sergeants fall in short order. However, I was surprised to see them inflict a fair number of casualties against the Khan's Guard. But reality set back in when we see the data. 0.24 KDR, which is nearly identical to the Legionary. Vlandian Sergeants versus Battanian Fian Champion. I'm fully expecting the Fian battle to go the same, but let's see. They actually performed worse than against the Kongsguard. Fascinating stuff, but I'm not entirely sure why, as the Kongsguard should do better overall based on the damage and weapon length. While the numbers are still ugly, they managed a better KDR against the Fians than they did with the Kongsguard at 0.27. Vlandian Sergeant versus Mixed Infantry. Now let's see how they hold up against greater numbers. We'll be using the exact same Imperial Tier 1 through Tier 4 troops, so we can accurately compare the data at the end. I was fully expecting the Sergeants to get stomped here, but to my surprise, they came out with a victory. While they didn't sweep all the battles, they did manage to win 6 out of the 10 and came out with a 2.5 KDR, which is better than the Legionary. Battania Oathsworn versus Battania Wildling. Now for the worst of the worst, the Battanian Shielded Infantry. From the previous tests, we know the Oathsworn are marginally better in melee combat than the Wildling, which was reinforced here. I was expecting a bigger margin of victory, however. The Wildling even managed a single win out of the 10 battles. The Oathsworn ended up with a depressing 1.46 KDR against the Wildling. Battania Oathsworn versus Aserai Veteran Infantry. The Aserai Infantry have a slight advantage in one-handed skill, but I think the Oathsworn have bigger issues like bad gear. As expected, the Oathsworn are torn apart with very little damage done to the Aserai troops. They didn't manage a single victory and ended with an abysmal 0.43 KDR. Battanian Oathsworn versus Khuzait Darkhan. Now, if Battania is going to have a chance of winning a single matchup, it'd be against the Darkhan. However, it was not to be. The Oathsworn are quickly defeated while barely taking out 25% of the enemy force. However, looking at the data, we see why several battles are important for accurate numbers. The Oathsworn were actually able to win 3 out of the 10 battles and ended with a near even KDR of 0.96, making both troops statistically the same. Battania Oathsworn versus Sturgia Heavy Spearmen. I misspoke on the previous round. The Heavy Spearmen should be the best matchup for the Oathsworn. Looking at the battle, it's a fairly close fight right from the start to end, but the Heavy Spearmen had a slight edge from the start. Once again, we needed the data to see the truth. Battania won 4 out of the 10 battles and ended with a 0.94 KDR, meaning both units are fairly close. Next, we have the Heavy Axemen with comparable combat stats. The battle is dead even once again from the start all the way to the finish, with the Oathsworn taking the lead right at the end. While the Oathsworn did win 6 out of the 10 battles, the KDR ended up at 1.06, which is right on the cusp of being statistically identical. I'm not sure exactly how big the margin of error should be here, but the results are razor thin. Battania Oathsworn versus Imperial Crossbowmen. Time for the ranged unit test using the Imperial Crossbowmen with the mace. The Oathsworn are outmatched, getting completely destroyed right from the start. Not only did they lose all battles, but the KDR was similar to the Kongsguard and Fian Champion at 0.25. I'm not sure if the Oathsworn are terrible or the Crossbowmen are OP. Battanian Oathsworn versus Imperial Elite Cataphract. Sadly, the correct recording was lost, so we'll skip right to the data, but surprisingly, the Cataphract dominated the Oathsworn. They didn't manage a single win and ended with only a 0.3 KDR. Battania Oathsworn versus Khuzait Kongsguard. Nobody expects the Oathsworn to do well here as they are outmatched in every aspect. The battle is over in seconds with very few casualties inflicted by Battania. It's one of the worst slaughters thus far with a 0.08 KDR over 10 battles. Battania Oathsworn versus Battania Fian Champions. We should see more of the same here going against their own noble archer, the Fian Champion. And as expected, the battle is over in mere seconds, although it does take longer than the Kongsguard. The data confirms this with a slightly better KDR of 0.11. Battanian Oathsworn versus Mixed Infantry. I'm not expecting the Oathsworn to win here, but I'm curious to see how they stack up against other infantry when going against lower tier units. The battle starts off well for the Oathsworn, taking out many enemy troops without many losses. But as time rolls on, their numbers quickly drop. My guess here is their armor isn't good enough to keep them in the fight for long. They didn't manage a single victory here, and some battles were disastrous, barely managing a 1 KDR. Over 10 battles, the KDR was a 1.5. Battania Wildling versus Aserai Veteran Infantry. I think we all know the next set isn't going to be pretty as the Wildlings are terrible in melee, so we'll speed this up a bit. The Aserai Veteran Infantry maul the Wildlings. Okay, I wasn't ready for these numbers. With 0.15 KDR, you might think they're up against the Kongsguard. Battania Wildling versus Khuzait Darkhan. The Darkhan didn't perform well in other tests, and looking at this battle, we can see that trend continue. They are definitely winning, but the Wildlings are still getting some kills here and there. By the end, the Wildling didn't manage a single win and a sad 0.28 KDR. Next, we'll test the Wildling with the Sturgian Infantry. Once again, we see a complete stomp with the Wildlings barely managing any kills. They lose all 10 battles and manage a 0.2 KDR. Battania Wildling versus Sturgia Heavy Axemen. Oddly enough, the battle takes longer and Sturgia take on more casualties than against the Spearmen. The data also confirms this with the Wildling getting a 0.37 KDR, nearly double. Battania Wildling versus Imperial Crossbowmen. Moving on to the non-infantry testing, starting with the Crossbowmen. Considering how dominant the Crossbowmen were in previous tests, I'm surprised to see the Wildling not get obliterated. They still lose 100% of the battles, but manage a 0.4 KDR, which is better than the Oathsworn. Next, let's test the dismounted Noble Cavalry. While the Cataphract have struggled against other infantry in these tests, they have zero issues slicing through the Wildlings. They didn't even manage a 0.2 KDR. Battania Wildling versus Khonsguard. The Wildlings didn't manage a single kill for several seconds, but eventually score a few by the end of the battle. Looking at the data, we see one of the worst performances of the series, only managing a 0.13 KDR. Battania Wildling versus Fiend Champion. The Champion should perform as well as the Khonsguard here. The Wildlings do get a few kills here and there, but are quickly routed. The Fiend's high athletic skill allowed them to run down fleeing enemies more efficiently as well. This time, the Wildlings didn't even manage to get 0.1 KDR. Battania Wildling versus Mixed Infantry. Perhaps the Wildlings excel at taking out lower tier infantry? While they certainly do get kills at the start, they quickly fade and flee, barely putting a dent into the mixed infantry numbers. They only managed a 1 KDR in a single battle, and ended with an overall KDR of 0.8, the worst of all the units so far. Aserai Veteran Infantry versus Khuzait Darkhan. We've seen decent numbers from the Veteran Infantry so far, so let's see how they do against the Darkhan. It's a very even battle for the first half, but the Veteran Infantry eventually pull ahead. The Veteran Infantry were able to win 100% of the time and managed a solid 2.8 KDR overall. Veteran Infantry versus Sturgia Heavy Spearmen. I was expecting a close fight here, but didn't realize the Spearmen would put up this good of a fight. They still lose, but looking at the data, we see a very close match. The Veteran Infantry managed to win 8 of the 10 battles and ended with a 1.3 KDR. Aserai Veteran Infantry versus Sturgia Heavy Axemen. Once again, the Axemen are outclassed and they lose by a wide margin. The Veteran Infantry win all 10 battles and come away with a 2.0 KDR. Aserai Veteran Infantry versus Imperial Crossbowmen. Time for the non-infantry units, starting with the crossbows. It's a very close battle right to the end, but the Veteran Infantry do pull ahead. The data shows these two units are comparably matched, with Aserai winning 6 out of the 10 and ending with a 1.0 KDR. Veteran Infantry versus Elite Cataphract. Now for the dismounted cavalry. The Veteran Infantry are holding their own, but halfway through the match, the Cataphract take over. It's not a complete stomp as the Veteran Infantry win 2 out of the 10, but end with only a 0.7 KDR. Veteran Infantry versus Khonsguard. Let's see how badly the Khonsguard stomp the Aserai. The Veteran Infantry actually performed better than I expected, but it's still a stomp. They lose all 10 rounds and barely manage a 0.2 KDR. Veteran Infantry versus Fiend Champions. The battle is over very quickly, much like all the other Fiend Champion tests thus far. Aserai don't win a single battle and end with a 0.3 KDR. And for the final test, we try against a bunch of low tier units. Like all the previous tests, the Veteran Infantry start off strong. The difference here is they actually hold that lead all the way through to the end. The data looks very promising. Only a single loss in 10 battles and a solid 4.5 KDR overall. Khuzait Darkhan versus Sturgia Heavy Spearmen. It's a fairly close battle, although the Spearmen have a slight advantage that follows through to the end. The Darkhan do manage to win 3 out of the 10 battles, but end with a 0.9 KDR. Khuzait Darkhan versus Sturgia Heavy Axemen. Again, we see a decent start for the Darkhan, but they quickly get overwhelmed and lose. They manage to win 2 out of the 10 battles, but end with a 0.76 KDR. Khuzait Darkhan versus Imperial Crossbowmen. The Crossbowmen put up a tough fight and end up winning this one, but if we look at the data, it's actually much closer to a dead even. The Darkhan win 4 out of the 10 battles and finish with a 0.96 KDR overall. Khuzait Darkhan versus Imperial Elite Cataphract. It's a mismatch right from the start, with the Cataphract holding a sizable lead the entire time. The Darkhan lose all 10 matches and barely manage a 0.2 KDR. Khuzait Darkhan versus Khonsguard. This won't be pretty. And sure enough, it's a landslide loss with very few deaths on the Khonsguard side. The Darkhan lose all 10 battles and barely hold a 0.15 KDR overall. Khuzait Darkhan versus Fian Champion. Once again, the battle is over quickly with few Fian losses. The Darkhan lost all 10 rounds and ended with a 0.2 KDR. Khuzait Darkhan versus Mixed Infantry. The Darkhan start off strong once again, but gradually fade as the number of mixed infantry begin to work. It comes down to the last few dozen men with the mixed infantry taking the win. The data also shows an incredibly close battle going 5 wins to each side and the Darkhan ending with a 3 KDR. Sturgian Heavy Spearmen versus Sturgia Heavy Axemen. Time for the Sturgian Civil War. It's a really close battle from start to finish and the outcome could have easily gone either way. The Axemen come out on top here, but looking at the data, it's still very close. Spearmen win 3 out of the 10 battles, but the KDR is right at 1, making them statistically equal. Sturgian Heavy Spearmen versus Imperial Crossbowmen. It's an incredibly close battle that could have gone either way, which we can see as well from the data. The Spearmen won 4 out of the 10 battles, but still managed a 0.96 KDR. Sturgian Heavy Spearmen versus Imperial Elite Cataphract. The Heavy Spearmen are clearly outmatched here from the start and quickly rout without causing much damage. They lose all 10 battles and end with a 0.38 KDR. Sturgian Heavy Spearmen versus Khonsguard. The Spearmen are wiped off the map quickly without causing much damage. The Khonsguard remain undefeated and the Spears end with a 0.15 KDR. Sturgia Heavy Spearmen versus Fian Champions. The Heavy Spearmen performance is about on par with the Khonsguard and they're soundly defeated. They only manage a 0.18 KDR overall. Sturgia Heavy Spearmen versus Mixed Infantry. Like all the other units that are tested, they start off strong without any losses for quite some time. However, the Heavy Spearmen hold their ground through the middle and late phase of the battle and come out on top. This is further supported by the data with the Heavy Spearmen only losing a single battle and ending with a 3.5 KDR overall. Sturgia Heavy Axemen versus Imperial Crossbowmen. The Heavy Axemen struggle from the beginning right to the end, but manage to squeeze out a win somehow. However, if we look at the data, we see they actually only won 3 out of the 10 battles. The KDR shows they are very closely matched, ending with a 0.95 KDR. Sturgia Heavy Axemen versus Elite Cataphract. The Axemen are very outmatched here and are wiped off the map quickly. They lose all 10 battles and end with a 0.44 KDR overall. Sturgia Heavy Axemen versus Khonsguard. As with all the other Khonsguard tests, it's not even close and the Axemen are routed. Shockingly, the Axemen actually performed well against the Khonsguard, relatively speaking. They managed a 0.44 KDR while most others were in the 0.1 to 0.2 range. Sturgia Heavy Axemen versus Fian Champions. Based on how quickly the battle was over, it doesn't seem like the Axemen do a better job against Fian Champions. Looking at the data, the Axemen only managed a 0.2 KDR, which is less than half of what they did in the Khonsguard test. And now we're at the final test of the video, the Axemen versus lower tier units. The Axemen hold strong for quite some time before the mixed infantry start to tear into their numbers. It's a decent fight, but the mixed infantry pull ahead by a good margin this time. Looking at the data, the Axemen only lost 2 of the 10 battles and ended with a respectable 2.81 KDR overall. I'm glad we ran multiple tests. Now that we've gone through all 700 battles, let's take an overall look at how each unit performed against everyone else. This spreadsheet is set up such that the rows represent the kills against their opponents in the column. For example, the Legionary killed 1.853 Vlandian sergeants per every 1 death that they sustained. But if you want to look at the sergeant's KDR versus the Legionary, then we have to move down 1 row and look for the Legionary. They earned a 0.54 KDR. For those mathematically inclined, we are finding the inverse or 1 divided by the result. Let's split the final section into 2 parts. First going row by row to see how they performed, and then finally going column by column to see which unit counters which the best. The Imperial Legionary performed very well against all other tier 5 shielded infantry, even earning nearly a 2.1 KDR at their worst and above 50 at their best. They performed decently against crossbow and dismounted cavalry, but struggled against Khonsguard and Fians, although that doesn't say much because everybody struggled against Khonsguard and Fians. However, the final column is the most interesting in my opinion. The Legionary didn't perform very well against large groups of opponents. They needed at least a 2.67 KDR to keep up with the mixed infantry, but fell short of that. So Legionary performed quite well against equal numbers of well-armored units, but struggled when outnumbered, meaning they need support from archers, cavalry, or shock troops against larger groups. And because the YouTube algorithm loves a tier list, here you go. A tier. Next, the Vlandian Sergeant. I was surprised to see these units perform decently. They struggled against Legionary like everyone else and also against veteran infantry, but did better than average against everyone else. They held their own against the crossbowmen, but failed miserably against dismounted cavalry and noble archers. Against mixed units, they're very close to break even performing better than the Legionary. The Vlandian Sergeant is a solid unit that can hold their own against just about every unit on the battlefield and will excel with some crossbow and cavalry support. A tier, but slightly behind the Legionary. I'm going to cover both Battania and Infantry together as they both performed poorly. The Wildling is definitely worse between the two, but frankly the Oathsworn was the bigger disappointment as their role is meant to be a frontline melee troop. The Wildling failed spectacularly against everyone, while the Oathsworn performed on par with the Darkhan, Spearmen, and Axemen. Against their most likely opponent, mixed infantry, they performed terribly, not even managing a 1.5 KDR. When using Oathsworn, only commit them to battle against similar numbers of lower tier troops. Personally, I've used them as shields to distract the enemy and nothing more. F tier for the Oathsworn, and as many Fs will fit in the formatting for the Wildling. Now for one of the biggest surprises for me of the video.
Drumroll, please.
The Aserai veteran infantry. They only struggled against the Legionary, but outside of that, their performance was way above average across the board. Even more importantly, they destroyed the mixed infantry groups with ease, earning a 4.5 KDR overall. These units are incredible to see in action, and I wouldn't hesitate to make an entire army focused around them specifically. S tier. Another unit I was surprised by was the Khuzait Darkhan. Considering their culture is primarily focused around mounted combat, they performed decently against other shielded troops. They were dominated by the Legionary and veteran infantry, but against everyone else, they were either slightly winning or just barely losing. More importantly, they performed really well against mixed infantry, which is their most likely role in a real campaign, earning just over a 3.0 KDR. While I wouldn't recommend building an army around these units, they can get in and break apart enemy infantry formations without getting dominated right away, allowing cavalry and horse archers to swarm from the flanks and clean up the rest. C tier. Let's look at the Sturgian infantry separately as they seem to be good at different things. The heavy spearmen earned similar numbers to the Darkhan, losing badly to most or barely breaking even against the rest. However, their weaponry and armor really proved their worth in the mixed infantry battles, earning a solid 3.5 KDR. Personally, I think the spearmen pair perfectly with their shock troops. This allows for some shielded protection against projectiles, spears to stop cavalry charges, and solid combat performance against larger numbers, while the shock troops can make up for their weaknesses against higher tier infantry. A tier, borderline B tier, but really it's only because of how well they did against mixed infantry. Let's say B tier. And finally, the Sturgian heavy Axemen. You might think Axemen would perform well against heavily armored opponents, but this was generally not the case. They had a better KDR against Sergeants and Darkhan, but worse everywhere else. Not only that, but the mixed troop KDR was lower as well, meaning there isn't much of a reason to use heavy Axemen over the Spearmen when it comes to melee combat, and I struggle to see another use for them considering they have the same upgrade tree and cost as the heavy Spearmen. Tailworlds, please fix this unit. D tier. For the last part, let's go column by column to see which unit provides the best counter from each category. Nobody counters the Legionary in equal numbered combat, although the Sergeant and Vlandian infantry did the best from the group. Use cavalry and archers to counter Legionary. Sergeants were countered easily by Legionary and to a lesser degree the veteran infantry. The Oathsworn are countered by literally everyone except the Wildling. The Wildling should only be used as skirmisher infantry. Do not commit them to melee combat unless you absolutely have to. The veteran infantry are only countered by the Legionary. The Darkhan are generally not good against other elite infantry and countered by everybody except for Battania. The heavy spearmen and axemen are similar, not really counting any elite infantry, but hold their own against most other troops. One of the biggest shockers of this video, the Imperial crossbowmen. They perform very well against everyone in melee combat. Keep in mind, they were set to hold fire, but in real combat, they could have a chance to pick off enemies as they approach, meaning you could potentially use crossbowmen as your main front battle line, and have the flexibility to get off a couple volleys of crossbow bolts when time permits. Dismounted cataphracts actually did well against everyone except the Legionary, reinforcing the idea that Legionary with maces beat heavily armored opponents. Cataphracts still perform better while mounted in most cases though. Nobody performed well against the Khan's Guard and the Fian champions, further cementing their GOAT status. If you want an easy peasy game, use only Fian and Khan Guard armies. And finally, against mixed units, the veteran infantry are king, followed by the Spearmen, the Darkhan, and the Axemen. Since most AI armies are rarely made up of all tier 5 infantry, this is likely the most important category, and any of these infantry can be counted on to do a great job. I'm curious what surprised you the most out of these results. Let me know down in the comments section. Thank you so much to Flasan19 for collaborating with me on this video, making it possible. A huge shout out to all the YouTube channel members and Patreon supporters for helping support my video game addiction. Thank you so much.